My name is Todd Schwartz, and I am the director of the Cincinnati chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for watching this webinar entitled How to Do Business in the Age of Disinformation: Is Freedom of Speech on Social Media a Blessing or a Curse?, which was recorded on March 4th, 2020. Because of a problem with the recording, the introductions for our speakers were cut off. So I will explain to you who the speakers are, and then you can watch the rest of the web program. Vinton Cerf is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. He is widely regarded as one of the fathers of the Internet, having co-designed some of the Internet's most important technology and architecture. He is a former member of the National Science Board, a current member of the National Academy of Engineering, and also a foreign member of the British Royal Society and Swedish Royal Academy of Engineering. Cerf has received both the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom and the U.S. National Medal of Technology, as well as the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, Légion d'honneur, and scores of other awards and honorary degrees. Dr. Janka Ortel is Director of the Asia Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She previously worked as a Senior Fellow in the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Berlin office, focusing on transatlantic China policy, including on emerging technologies, Chinese foreign policy, and security in East Asia. Prior to that, she was a program director at the Kerber Foundation's Berlin office. Janka holds a PhD from the University of Jena in Germany. Her other professional experiences include time at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and as a Carlos Schmid Fellow. She has published widely on topics related to security in the Asia-Pacific region, Chinese foreign policy, 5G, and emerging technologies, and United Nations peacekeeping. You will also see on the screen my colleague Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. She is the Executive Director of the New York chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce. And now, let's join the webinar. Let me just go ahead and get started maybe with a quick question to begin. And I'll start maybe with you. Maybe you could just quickly give us an overview of why is this a topic? I mean, how did we get to the point where we're all talking about disinformation and freedom of speech in the context of social media? And how did we get to this point?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we are where we are is that the openness of the system invited anyone with the proper equipment and access to participate, to express themselves. Moreover, we didn't require anyone to identify themselves as to who they actually are. And that anonymity, while very attractive in many respects, also gives rise to behavior patterns that are potentially harmful because the anonymity, to the extent that it shields you like a pane of glass in the car, allows people to say things that they probably would not say if they were face-to-face or if they were identified. I'm not arguing, by the way, that that means therefore everyone must be identified in order to speak. But as we explore this question of improving the quality of the dialogue that takes place in the internet environment, we might want to explore the role of anonymity, pseudonymity, and identity in order to figure out whether that will produce a more moderated discussion than the ones that we're observing right now. The social media also have some feedback loops in them that drive extreme behaviors and extreme expressions for the purpose of gaining attention. This is also sometimes called the attention economy. There's a finite amount of that available, and people whose businesses depend on the attention of others may find it valuable to introduce those feedback loops, but then they have side effects. Let me stop there. There's a lot more I'm sure we can talk about, but I think we want to hear from Janka as well.
Janka, your thoughts?
And maybe that's, Vin, thank you so much. This was a lot on the receiving end of things and how we got there on the technology side. but there's also like a sender element to this. Disinformation, I would define it as, or it has been defined as, the purposeful dissemination of false information intended to mislead or harm. And the intent here is relatively key because it's intentionally designed to
Mm-hmm.
kind of create disturbances, to create disinformation. It is a highly sensitive topic and has to be very carefully navigated because the lines are very blurry. What other people say is good PR other people can already say is disinformation, and the lines are very, very, very difficult to draw. What we have witnessed in the past few years, though, is a huge rise in state-sponsored actions. So things, actions in the platforms that we use, that we all know, from that were targeted by state actors to purposefully disturb our political systems or to disturb our economic systems. And I think this is something that has a new quality. And this is something that we need to closer evaluate at this point in time, because it has gotten a lot cheaper and a lot more effective to target a lot more people. So it's relatively easy now to get false information out, and it's really difficult to rein all that back in. And for a state, in the hands of a state who is a powerful actor in and of itself, this is even more powerful a tool that you can use and with which you can create a lot of havoc. And I think that's where we are at the moment, where we have to kind of navigate this space by kind of not closing ourselves off, not getting less open, not shutting all of the great usefulness of social media down, but to still be able to regulate it to a certain degree, so that we are not, subject to other states' interference. And that's a very, very fine line to walk.
So you use the term regulate, and of course, many people run away when they hear words like that. There is the notion of self-regulation. There also is a notion of incentive to self-moderate, for example. That's sometimes good and sometimes not so good. So if we take an authoritarian state, which says, if you say anything along these lines against the state, bad things will happen to you, and people self-moderate because of that. But that's not necessarily the best outcome, because what that means is that you don't have an honest kind of dialogue about issues arising out of fear. So I think the other thing that I wanted to observe about the pernicious nature of the problem we're beginning to discuss is that it doesn't take very much truth to make untruth palatable and or at least acceptable. Especially if you don't know anything about the untrue aspect. If you see a list of assertions and some of them you recognize as true, it's entirely possible that you will accept the others that you know nothing about because there was some truth in the mixture, and it doesn't take very much truth to cause others to accept untruth. A very good example of this is newspapers, and this is not to cast aspersions on newspapers, but if you read an article about which you know something, almost invariably you will find some things that you know to be untrue. Then you turn to an article about which you know nothing, and since there isn't anything in there to give you a clue that there might be an untruth because you don't know enough, you accept everything instead of rejecting everything. And so our minds are peculiar in this regard, and I suspect somewhere, Todd, in the course of this conversation, we might ask ourselves, do we know enough about how our brains work to understand both why the phenomenon occurs? What about the sort of confirmation bias and things of that sort, comfort inside of an information bubble, and inability to think critically, or unwillingness to think critically about what we see and hear? If we could get more wetware going, we might actually deal with some of the problem.
I agree fully with you. I think we would also kind of need to understand the flood of information that is kind of hammered on everybody here, and how very skillfully actors can abuse that. And I think the skill set that we see is that it has been tracked over the last year by a team at Oxford University. There was a big study that was done. It was called the Global Inventory of Organized Social Media Manipulation. And it compared a huge amount of campaigns that you could see that were targeted specifically at audiences in the countries. And you could see that from 2017, when there was about 28 countries that had this kind of manipulation in their countries, targeted specifically at the population. This is up to over 70 countries now where we see this. And there are specific actors behind this that have been named. It's China, it's Iran, Pakistan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. There's a range of actors that use these tools. And I think one thing is to know that, you know, we are all susceptible to it, and we kind of all have to question ourselves and question our brain functions and see, you know, what is true and what is not true. The other thing is that it's really hard when the amount becomes really large. Mark Zuckerberg said at the Munich Security Conference that they're taking down almost 1 million fake accounts a day. That is a lot of information. There's just a lot to
I want to
process.
bring this back to something that Todd implied in his opening remarks, and that is, why do we care in the business world about this? The most dramatic reason that we care is that in some countries, not knowing how else to deal with the problem, they shut the internet down. And although that is it's certainly sufficient, it isn't necessary, and yet that is the tool that's chosen, and it harms everyone whose businesses rest on top of the penetration of this infrastructure and the availability of content. So we should care about that, because we want to find alternative responses than that to cope with the harmful effects of misinformation and disinformation.
Right. Well, and that's actually a really good point, because I absolutely did want to come back. I mean, again, we are a chamber of commerce, so, you know, we want to think about this particularly from the point of view of business and trade and the broader economy, of course. But I think one of the questions, we keep talking about state actors. We hear about this in the context of elections and so forth. But maybe we'd spend just a minute or two talking about the motivations. I mean, so what's driving this? I mean, you know, now people have discovered that you can use social media to drive opinion, to change things, to drive wedges, create polarization, and so forth. But why? And start there.
Todd, it seems to me that this is not necessarily new. I'm sure Janka will remember, or at least if you weren't around at the time, and neither was I, but there was, you know, the yellow press of the late 19th century, leading to, you know, things like the Spanish-American War, you know, the Hearst papers and so on. That people have figured out ways of using various media in order to achieve some of these objectives, which is to influence people's thinking and their actions, and doing so in a way that that uses misinformation or misrepresentation as a way to do that. Knowing something about people's fears and concerns and playing upon those in order to incite certain kinds of action. I think self-awareness about this is part of the solution to the problem. But I am interested to know whether Janka sees a regulatory option that's available. I mean, here at YouTube, for example, there are very concerns about certain kinds of content, which is just, you know, totally inappropriate, you know, child pornography and other kinds of abusive practices that involve children is just unacceptable. And there's a great deal of effort applied to try to filter that out. But there might be other things that that could be done, and I'm sure that has to be a part of what Janka has been arm wrestling with over the past, well, we would say certainly the last couple of years, but maybe much longer in her career.
Yeah, what I find difficult at the moment is to kind of to get all the categories right. Because if you want to regulate something, then, you know, you can talk about something in very unspecific terms, but laws should be specific, and laws to be enforced need to be very specific, and you need to be very clear in attributing something. You need to be very clear in finding exactly the right box that fits into to regulate it. And that's probably the most difficult part about this. Also very difficult is the fact that some of this is taking place in the open part of the internet. It's taking place on open platforms. A lot of this is taking place in closed settings. It's taking place in messaging apps. It's taking place where it's really hard for anyone else who is not part of the in-group to see what's going on. And the effect can be like a wave later on. You don't even see it coming, but then it mounts really badly. So I think for countries at the moment, or for governments to deal with this, is the only effective way to do this is in close collaboration with those that provide the platforms. And then there are certain things that can be technologically done. in terms of regulation, and some things just where a call needs to be made in kind of balancing out different goods, balancing security versus privacy. I mean, these are decisions that governments have to take every day. And in free and open societies, these decisions are fortunately much more difficult. But I think that's exactly where we are in that space where we are at the moment, where we need to figure out what exactly that kind of regulation should look like. If we look at the kind of, because you were saying disinformation is not new, it's completely old. It's propaganda is the oldest form of doing this. I mean, this has been like part of the toolbox of every country, and it's just the scale that is so different, and the way that you can make it seem like actual news, because the entire atmosphere of truth has been distorted, because there is no such thing as real trust in information anymore. And I think we have to self-critically say that we have all sort of in the Western world contributed very much to that as well. This is not something that authoritarian states have kind of loaded on top of us, but they have used inroads that we have delivered and that our societies have delivered. And I think it's this new geopolitical climate in which all of this comes to the fore, and in which companies have to navigate a completely different space, in which even when they want to give out truthful information, it's a lot harder to do so. It's a lot harder to get your message out and to be believed. If there is, a counter argument out there, if there is a concerted campaign against you, and it can happen very, very quickly. And I think for businesses, it takes a lot of learning, and it takes a lot of communications with people that you normally didn't communicate that much with. So academia, think tank, other businesses, the government. It's just completely different kind of information space that has to be created around this.
So this actually raises an interesting question in my mind, and that's about response, for example, to a misinformation or disinformation campaign. If a company is unaccustomed to operating in that space, and they are being attacked in a space that their customers might be inhabiting, the inability to respond quickly could easily cost the company a great deal of reputational loss. And I think we all understand that building a trusted reputation is very difficult. Losing it is easy and very hard to rebuild. That suggests to me that companies who operate willy-nilly, whether they like it or not, even if they don't use these media, other people may use them and cause reputational harm. They need to learn how to cope with this new medium and the way in which it is abused. So you need fast reaction teams, for example, to respond to misinformation that might get out there. It's also very hard to deal with proving a negative. If somebody asserts that you did X and you say, no, I didn't, how do you prove that you didn't do X, or that you don't do X, or that your product doesn't do X? And now that's where you start looking around for credible sources other than yourself to respond, because if you've lost credibility because of this disinformation campaign, it's very hard to defend yourself because it sounds defensive.
What I find quite interesting is that there are a couple of lessons learned that we can see from attacks on governments, attacks on other governments. So, for example, Taiwan is an interesting case here in point that has had severe attacks in the disinformation space, and has kind of a SWAT team, a rapid response team within the government, where exactly as that is done, where they say, if you don't get a different message out, if you don't get the counter narrative out in 60 minutes, you're done. Then it's all over the place. You can forget about it. And the best thing is you get it out in just minutes. For a company, that may even be easier than for a government, because for a government to go through all those hoops that you have to go through to get a message out is really difficult. But it has been proven that it's actually possible if the structures are put into place. So if you have this kind of red button structures in which you can say, hold on, watch out, we need to do something and we need to react right now, and it has an immediate line to the head of government or the CEO for that matter, where the same kind of decision has to be taken, I think it actually can work, and you can work with the truth, but it is more difficult, of course.
So I have to say that there is a flip side to this. If it's too easy for the government to respond, like just typing in a tweet, then and there's no consideration at all, that's not necessarily a great solution
Are you
to
talking about the
the
current
problem.
situation in the United States?
I wasn't gonna raise any specific
We're a
example.
non-political organization,
Right.
friend.
Yes. But I mean the fact that that the media are so readily accessible and so rapidly replicating of content. I mean, the way the example of Twitter is tweeting and retweeting, which means you're rapidly proliferating to each party's network, and so the expansion rate is very, very rapid. I mean, it's almost epidemic. I mean, not to draw a parallel with the coronavirus or anything, but the dynamics and mechanics are very much like that. It's almost as if we should think of information epidemics and ask ourselves, how do we respond to that? Is there an analog of the medical response to an academic and I'm sorry, an epidemic, not an academic. Sometimes there's some actually academics could also be a problem. But is there an information equivalent of a response to an epidemic of bad information? And you touched on some of that. It's sort of like thinking ahead, knowing what some arguments might be made to be troublesome and preparing responses to that ahead of time.
Yeah, I think we can also see in the, there's a very current example at the moment about the coronavirus, and Facebook for the first time actually scanning content and taking actively disinformation down to protect people's lives, which I think is an exception. This is not going to be the rule in the future that Facebook is going to do exactly that and going to actually scan content, but to say we have to save and protect people's lives. So disinformation about this disease, potential information about cures that are out there, all of that has to be taken down by us because we can do that. And also, which I found is a very good example of how very actively also the platforms can support this. They're offering free ad space for the WHO at the moment, as much as they want and as much as they like, to basically how can you amplify a positive message, or how can you amplify a true message that is important, especially in a case of crises. So I think these are responses that a couple of years ago maybe you wouldn't have seen, but I think there is a sensitivity within the platforms themselves as well, that there are areas in which it can become extremely dangerous and it can become threatening, and so where it is really important to kind of play their part in this in the information game.
So to play this back for just a moment, having a sense for the credibility of sources of information is part of the whole story of critical thinking, where you get to ask things like, where did this information come from? Is there corroborating evidence from other sources? Maybe the situation we're in right now creates an opportunity to teach the general public and politicians and business people what the dynamics of these things are and why critical thinking is so important and why we should be teaching it at all grade levels and make it a normal part of life. It doesn't make you a cynic. It makes you a thoughtful person and a seeker of truth.
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, that's especially true for the space where you have alternative access to information as well, where you can check and check back. This is obviously a lot more difficult in more regulated spaces. So in the Chinese media environment, for example, it's a lot harder to check the facts because basically all you are being presented with is the government line, and that can be truthful or disinformation, but you don't get a proper alternative, and that makes it a lot harder. I think again you can see in the current crisis, in the coronavirus crisis, that this does have an effect on the trust in government. It has an effect on how you perceive information, and that there is a desire by people to get alternative sources, to check against other information. And I think we're very privileged in our Western world, where we have access to a lot of information, where we can actually do that. But I think we also still need to kind of be very mindful of malign intent that is very, very hard to deal with. And this is something, that's why I think the question of criminal activities, trolling, all that kind of stuff that you see, this is something that companies need to worry about, but it's more in the legal space. It's more in the, this is something that you kind of have to deal with and have to get security measures in place, as with every other kind of danger that is out there. But the state question, state directed actions that can, if they amplify, for example, a competitor that is from a different country, that can have a hugely greater impact than other actions could have. And I think that what companies kind of need to be mindful of is this new space in which they find themselves, where this is just part of great power toolkits, where this is just part of how authoritarian governments that become important economic actors play. And if you have that in your mind, and if you know that, then you can respond to it. But if you kind of do not understand this geopolitical context, then it becomes a lot more difficult.
I wanted to step in and just say, I think there's two particular points to look into here. I think we've talked a little bit about the regulatory issues. I don't think there would be a lot of disagreement with people if I said that it's clear that Europe, particularly when it comes to sort of privacy and internet regulation, is well ahead of the United States, at least at the federal level, leaving aside actions of states like California and so forth, and I'm sure Vint might have some comments on that. But I think the other part of it is, anytime that you have a problem, anytime you see a challenge, businesses tend to be very opportunistic, and they see that as like, this is a great opportunity. And now popping up, you have dozens, hundreds of little companies that say, we will fix your reputation, we will monitor your social media links, and so forth and so on. I'm just curious, I'd be interested in your comments, again, thinking specifically more about the business economic, and not just sort of for an individual company, but for an industry, for a trading relationship and so forth. But just talk like, again, the regulatory environment for electronic business in Europe. That's very different than it is in the United States. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and maybe Vint, if you wanted to start with that.
Let me suggest that the topic you're introducing is rather broad, because there are a great many different aspects that one wants to be concerned about. Thinking about electronic business in general, one of the most important things in an online environment is to have strong identity or strong authentication of the parties who may be transacting. And we need to have international agreements about how to establish digital identity in an online environment in a way which is not only trustable, but it is also, let's say, acceptable in a legal proceeding. So if I digitally sign an electronic document, and later there is a dispute, it's very important that the signature hold weight, in the sense that it is adequate demonstration of a commitment by a party in multiple jurisdictions, depending on where a dispute might be adjudicated or perhaps mediated. So I think that we don't yet have a common agreement that across multiple countries about what a digital certificate means, and how much weight do we give to a digital signature using cryptography and hashing and so on. And we would benefit from having some common multilateral agreements about that. So when you go to outfit yourself with the capability to digitally sign a contract, that there is widespread agreement about the strength of that identification. I'm sure that if you had Tumas Ilves on this call, he would talk about what has happened in Estonia, where every citizen has a strongly authenticated identity in the digital space. So that's one area where we could benefit from some common agreements, so as to make digital transactions more readily enforceable.
Sure. Janke, did you want to talk about maybe a little bit of the regulatory frameworks?
Maybe the regulatory, not so much the regulatory framework, but I think the question of what can businesses do to be part of this conversation. Of
course, yeah.
Because I think that for me is quite an under-researched subject so far. we are looking, if I can just, from an academic perspective, from the think tank world, if we talk disinformation, we mostly talk about states, we talk about governments being affected. That business slice of the conversation is largely left out. And I just checked before the conversation, checked again in the Oxford study that I mentioned earlier. Business wasn't mentioned once. It was only mentioned one time. And that's reminded me when you just said your introduction, that you said, business become part of this. Because there is this little PR firm that can fix your problems. They can also amplify a message, and they can also become part of this whole game of disinformation. And so they are more agents in the disinformation producing world than they are on the receiving end. And that's, of course, is a problem if that's the perception, because that's also a problem if that's the perception of the business community, because then they are not ready to understand that they are also subject to this and that they will be affected just as much. So I think we need to close that kind of intellectual gap in the research between the academic side, the government side, and the business side, because in this new world, the agency of businesses is just as big as states. I was when I was in Munich at the security conference, Wolfgang Ischinger opened with Mark Zuckerberg saying, if Facebook were a state and Zuckerberg would be the head of government, his would be the largest state. And he would have a different position at the Munich Security Conference. And I think it kind of puts it in perspective as well. This is a different framework where we need to these nicely siloed up places have to stop, and we have to kind of work together.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an alternative response to this problem of reputation. At least from the Google point of view, we have a 168-page manual which describes how manual evaluation of websites and YouTube videos is to be done for our purposes, which is to try to identify quality content. And so there's very lengthy process which is undertaken manually to evaluate both YouTube videos and websites in terms of quality. And then we train machine learning algorithms based on what we get back from this manual process in order to automate the evaluation given the scale of content that needs to be examined. Of course, the machine learning algorithms are never perfect, but they are intended to emulate what we learn from manual evaluation. Those data, the information about how to evaluate a website or a YouTube video for quality is publicly available. And so one way to respond to this is to, instead of going to the search engine optimization person, who may very well be a charlatan for all we know, this is an alternative way of looking to see how these systems actually evaluate websites and to follow the guidelines that we would give to the evaluators so that you can match the criteria that elevate quality and therefore elevate, for example, search response.
I think you're muted, Todd.
Todd is muted. Todd is still muted.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. And exactly, I mean, I think, we keep wanting to come back to this question and maybe to wrap up before we start to go to some questions and comments that we've received, and thanks to the folks who submitted those. So, I mean, thinking about businesses in particular, I mean, maybe you can just give us some, either, if nothing else, maybe just a couple of quick things to watch out for. What are the challenges? What do you need to be aware of? And especially, are there some things that companies should be doing? Some advice that you can have for companies to say, this is either I need to hire some consultant to work with me on this, or I need to make sure my IT team, maybe let's go there.
So I would say the same advice that I would give to governments is also holding true for companies. It's you need to map your vulnerabilities. You know exactly where the access points are, where it's most difficult, where your largest vulnerabilities are. Then the same second advice is create the structures that help you drive a message to counter disinformation quickly. That's probably the key level in this, and we've talked about this earlier before. And then to kind of lead by example and stay trustworthy, and stay in touch with your audience, stay in touch with your citizens, your customers, to kind of portray that trustworthy message on and over and over again, just kind of be in constant communication. That can be helpful. This is not a master plan for no disaster, but I think these are, if you follow those 3 steps, then you can have like at least a chance at getting it a little bit righter than you would without it.
Vinton, your thoughts?
Well, I think Janka has painted a fairly actionable picture for the business sector as well as for governments to be responsive. Her point about rapid response, I think, is worthy of reiteration here because of the rapid dynamics of a lot of the online environment. If there's anything different about the problem that we have in the online world, it is the speed with which information propagates. You can. Do you remember that there was a? I don't remember what it was. One of the pain relieving companies. It wasn't aspirin. It was one of the others that was. Someone poisoned some of the plastic dispensers of that medicine.
Tylenol. That was Tylenol.
Yes, it was Tylenol. Thank you for that. And so what was impressive about their reaction was it was nearly instantaneous. They took everything off the shelves, they redesigned the packaging, and they told everybody what they were doing. That transparency turned out to be an extremely powerful antidote to what otherwise could have been a major reputational disaster. And I wonder whether there is a seed of importance hiding in there about the transparency over the response, as opposed to saying, well, it was only 6 or 7 bottles, and so the probability of your being poisoned is very low, so don't worry about it. They didn't react that way. So I guess, Janka, to come back to you, how important is the transparency side of this to coping with a disinformation campaign?
I think that's absolutely key. You're absolutely right. We always say that like sunlight is the best disinfectant, and it's true. If you have the things out in the open, it's much easier to talk to deal with the problem. The problem is that when you deal with very opaque states and very opaque systems, that becomes even more difficult. And so that's where I see it's a greater challenge. It's easier if all the agency lies with you. But if you are if you're trying to uncover something, if you're trying to shed transparency on actors that are deliberately designed to be intransparent because that's kind of their raison d'etre, then it becomes very, very, very hard.
I think that's a good place to maybe start to go to some of the Q&A. I mean, maybe that's a bit just as maybe our panelists take a look at some of the comments that we've already received there, just to say that maybe transparency becomes part of our own evaluation system. That is, if it becomes very difficult to figure out where information is coming from, if it's hard to figure out, is this a credible news source? If it's hard to understand, where is this, who is this person? If I can't find those details, that in and of itself may be an important signal. Maybe I need to give this a little less weight in my consideration and more weight to the sources and systems that I can easily see what's behind it and that are being very transparent in their thoughts. So
Todd, I'm looking at the Q&A now. Catherine Pruitt puts up a very interesting question. She says, are there any concrete examples of companies that have been caught in such a situation, caught in a disinformation campaign? And actually, she said, ideally, a company that is not a major multinational, but the example that comes to mind is Procter and Gamble, which suffered for some time with the conspiracy theories about the logo on one of their products. And it's just a bizarre campaign that said it was satanic and all kinds of other stuff. And that was before we were as deeply invested in online technologies and social media than we are today, and yet that was a very pernicious and long-standing campaign. I don't remember, and I'm hoping Janka or Todd will remember exactly how they countered that, or if they countered that particular odd campaign.
So, Procter and Gamble, a big Cincinnati company. So, that you raise very bad memories here.
Sorry about that.
At the end of the day, the most important thing they did is they don't use that logo anymore. They modified the logo.
Wow,
They
wow.
fought a couple of lawsuits on that. I remember, most people. You and I will remember this event, or at least I will, because I'm pretty old. Phil Donahue, the Phil Donahue shows, the top
Yeah.
executives from Procter and Gamble would go on talk shows to say this isn't true, it's ridiculous, it's outrageous, and so forth and so on. So, but basically, at the end of the day, they pretty much had to kill that logo.
So what that says though is it's an example of hijacking of something
Mm-hmm.
and repurposing it. And in the online media, because of the rapidity and feedback loops that are involved in the speed of propagation, the repurposing of some logo or symbol is more feasible now than ever. And I consider that to be a serious challenge. It may not be resolvable by simply standing up and trying to be transparent about it.
Yanka, one question came up. I think you mentioned something about.
I'm just seeing at the Taiwan question.
Yeah.
So what I was mentioning was Audrey Tang, the digital minister in Taiwan, in an interview once said that they've kind of have this rapid response force, and they're trying to target something in 60 minutes time within the government structures. So it's about 1 hour, which is very, very impressive. And I'm not sure how far they are along in that, but that's their aim. And so that was, I think, the Taiwan question. And Taiwan is a great example of a government that has really embraced the question of how do we govern the digital space? How do we incorporate it? How do we make it a good space for us? How do we use it for the good of mankind? How do we use it, give it like a human-centric perspective? It's quite interesting to see how they have kind of become a little lab for that, and how to do that. Sort of also like Estonia has done. It has been like smaller countries have embraced the opportunity side of the digital space much more, and have found been interesting as case studies. And there was the question on if Facebook is able to take down inaccurate information around the coronavirus, whether that begs the question of who decides what's in the public interest. So I think that's a very, very good example of exactly the quagmire that the platforms find themselves in, because obviously they don't want that to be their call. They don't want to say what's in the public interest in normal circumstances. But I think in the case of a global pandemic, that's one of those cases where one can say there is a global public interest. This is not a particular, this is not a regional, this is not a national public interest. This is like in the global interest of mankind to stop a virus from spreading. And I think that to make that call to me seems very reasonable, but I would be interested, if that's your perspective as well from the tech sector yourself. Would you have made the same call there as Mark Zuckerberg?
I think so. Although the other thing, which is very important, is that inaccurate information can include false cures, for example, which would lead people to think that they are symptom-free or they're not contagious, and then go off and infect more people. Misinformation about this is highly dangerous, and therefore, I think everyone who is a potential avenue for the propagation of that misinformation needs to be engaged in order to limit that. I'd like to pick up the other question that Manfred posed, and this is about the transparency question, like the source of information, where is it coming from? I think it's highly valuable to know where information has come from, and I believe many of the misinformation campaigns deliberately falsify the sources, either false flag like behavior or otherwise obscure where it came from, or simply rely on anonymity to propagate disinformation. So I'm actually a big fan of strongly authenticated sources. And I can imagine a possibility that if we allowed people to strongly identify themselves, sufficient that it would be hard for someone else to say something on your behalf, in the same sense as preventing someone from performing a transaction on your behalf that drained your bank account, then we might end up valuing information that comes from an identifiable source more than from unidentified sources. There are special cases like whistleblowers and things like that. But even in that case, you can imagine having a trusted party assert that the whistleblower identified himself or herself to their satisfaction, and we trust the intervening party to be honest about this and to say, I can't, I won't reveal the name or the identity of the whistleblower, but I can confirm that adequate bona fides were shown so as to enhance the credibility of whatever is being reported. So I like the idea of people having the choice of strongly authenticating themselves uh, in order to be able to say something that others, in order to prevent others from saying things in their behalf.
I'm going to quickly launch a poll here. It should pop up on everybody's screen. I'm just interested to see how people, just from our audience, how are they really thinking about this? So the question very there is, how confident are you as an individual that the information you use to make your political and business decisions is uniformly accurate and free from bias?
Wow!
I just,
Wow! Yeah.
just to see how that adds. I mean, we can wait to see how people respond to that as we look at one of the other.
I'm very curious about that. I wanted to come back to Yanka though to see whether she had anything to add to this question about strong authentication of sources as a tool for inhibiting some bad behaviors, the ones that involve identity hijack.
I agree with you that in our environment, this makes a lot of sense. What I always think of is also the environments that are non-free environments. And obviously, if you have to authenticate yourself very clearly, then that also makes it it makes it a lot easier to track and trace you. And in
Yeah.
an environment in which the legal space is a bit different than here. So I think about dissidents in authoritarian systems where this becomes a lot more difficult. So I completely agree with your point, but I always think of the other side as well, where anonymity has provided a certain degree of leverage.
I think the way we resolve that potential conflict is to say to make it optional whether or not you strongly identify yourself or not, under the conditions where your assertion that we're in a venue where a false assertion attributed to you would be harmful, and assuming that your identity is you're not making yourself unsafe by identifying yourself, then you have the option of using this strong authentication so that if somebody else tries to say something on your behalf, you can say, prove that you are me. And if you can't do that, then everybody should disregard what was said.
Yeah, I think that really works well in our environment. I think there is a different, we already have two internets, we already have two worlds, the free and the non-free world of the internet, and kind of thinking about the non-free world and some mechanisms that could work there as well are somehow useful, I think, as well. But I fully agree with you that for our part of the world that makes total sense.
So let's look at the results of the poll, which says that there's actually more positive than I would have expected, to be honest. I was thinking it would all be.
We don't know how honest people are being. I'm shocked that no one is very confident that the information that they use is uniformly accurate.
Right. I'm shocked. Yes.
There you go.
There's also gambling going on there, right?
Good old German state television. No one believes in that anymore, it seems.
Right. Well, let's keep going. My favorite question has popped up. Where does blockchain sit in this conversation, and doesn't that solve some of the problems? That's from Joanna Massey. My answer to this is run the other way. Blockchain does not solve all problems. It is, however, a manifestation of the power of public key cryptography, because that's what's basically used to sign the blocks. And so it's that particular mechanism, the digital signature, that is at work here. I don't believe you need the entire blockchain mechanism in order to successfully use public key cryptography to authenticate the origin of information. You do have to have a place to register where the cryptographic public key or the private key is associated with a party, so that you can use it to identify the origin of some assertion that's digitally signed. So I think blockchain could be used to do this, but it isn't a necessary tool. What is necessary is the digital signature.
Just to, my job, of course, is to manage the time. So just to let everybody know, we got about 6 minutes left. So we can keep going through some of these questions.
I like Manfred's comment about if you choose not to identify yourself, it should show unidentified source. I agree with that. We should assert specifically that this statement is unauthenticated or unidentified as the provenance.
If you want to make anonymous comments, you should be free to do so. Just it needs to be clear that this is anonymous. Weigh that as you feel.
What about Thomas' statement? This is something I haven't absorbed yet.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand it. This is an excerpt from the U.S. Constitution.
Wow. The senators and congressional representatives shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of peace be privileged from arrest during their attendance. Thus, disinformation is given credence. That's interesting. Well, not quite. I think we just said that we won't arrest them. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to believe everything they say because we didn't arrest them.
How do you tell a politician is lying when his lips are moving, right? I shouldn't say that. I should not say that. That's terrible.
Maybe I can say a word to Marcel's question, how the transatlantic relationship and the trade investment climate is infected by disinformation. I think what we've seen a very, very interesting recent case in the 5G case, where we saw for the first time that the US actually tried an influence campaign in Europe, where they actually tried to say, look, we have a suggestion here on what your business decisions should be, because we are really, really worried about what you're doing and it could have an effect on us. Because the level of trust about that kind of information, about the facts that the US government were presenting as facts to their European audience, there was a very limited amount of trust in that. And that has already had a huge effect. And that just tells us that the entire information climate is very poisoned, even in such close relations as the transatlantic relationship. So there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to take place to restore and reestablish that kind of trust before any kind of trusted communications environment transatlantically can be reestablished. And it was, for me, quite shocking to see how little the trust is. Because from a German perspective, the response always was, why should we care? The NSA is spying on Merkel's phone anyways. It was like all of these rumors coming. Right. Not that wasn't a rumor, but that, all of these communications were coming up again and again and again. And it was kind of the level of trust has reached a low point. And I think that does have, as you say, an effect on the possibility of a future trade agreement, on the future of the relationship, on the way we can work together.
And you add on top of that digital tax disputes, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all of these things just it compounds on each other. So.
Well, Christina's question is a very general and difficult one, which we will not be able to respond to in 3 minutes or something. I will say, however, that the internet is a very layered architecture, and the players in the various layers are often quite different. The people that provide physical infrastructure are not the same as the ones who apply applications up in the social media space. And so if there is, in fact, regulation needed, it may vary dramatically in terms of the nature of the regulation and the parties who enforce it, depending on what layer in this architecture you attempt to deal with abusive behaviors. I don't think, for example, that the ITU should be involved in content regulation. I don't think that's within its purview in any case. And I would not rule out the possibility that you would get different regulatory frameworks depending on whether you're looking at a national level regulation versus global agreement. There is a group called the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which has suggested an alternative to regulation, and that is the adoption of norms, which are not necessarily enforceable, but they can be very helpful, and they are sometimes a prelude to treaty-like agreements. So one of the norms they suggested is that we agree not to attack the public core of the internet, like the domain name servers and the routers and so on, or the actual physical cables, in the same way that in wartime and in peacetime, we agree not to drop bombs on schools and hospitals. So there is some progress being made in the direction of a regulatory response or possibly self-regulatory response, but it's an extremely complex problem, especially writ large in the global sphere.
And if I can add here one sentence, this is exactly the space in which especially Russia and China have demonstrated an enormous amount of attention in terms of just kind of portraying a regulatory and a normative environment for the kind of internet that serves authoritarian governments. And we have to be very careful not to let that slip, because we have a disdain for multilateral architectures, or we have a disdain for these kind of bodies because things are lengthy, because this is going to be used, and these fora are going to be used by players that have different intent and have a different motivation, and we have to be very careful in that space.
I agree.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, we still have a couple of comments left, but I think that's a good spot to start wrapping up. The one thing that came into my mind as Vint was speaking on this last point, it's almost as if we need a universal declaration of internet rights.
Well, there is a UN report called a Declaration of Interdependence, which was delivered to the Secretary General in June of last year. And it spoke to the question of digital cooperation among countries. And whether we have a universal declaration or not, we are going to have international agreements about how to deal with abuses in the internet space.
That's true. Okay. Well, thank you all for your participation. That concludes today's webinar entitled How to Do Business in the Age of Disinformation. Is Freedom of Speech on Social Media a Blessing or a Curse? I want to offer our deepest thanks to our panelists, Jan Ortel and Vint Cerf, for sharing their experience and their insight, and also to all of you for joining us in today's discussion. As I mentioned, this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel in a few days. Please stay in touch with your local chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce, and of course, look for the European Council on Foreign Relations on their website for information on upcoming webinars and for events. And and I think that's all I have to say. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you much. Have a good day.